In the late 19th century, the legendary Irish playwright Oscar Wilde wrote, "There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what you want, and the other is getting it." This is a story about the second kind of tragedy. So my name here is not important. All you need to know is that for many years, I worked as a journalist in my native Brazil. I grew up under the military dictatorship, and while I was never a communist myself, I was greatly inspired by the story of a man called Vlado. Originally from Croatia, Vlado was a Marxist who moved to Brazil to become a journalist, and after the military took power, he was a constant thorn in their side. In the end, they faked his disappearance and presumably ended his life. Words alone made them so weak that they took his life. And it's no exaggeration to say that inspired a whole generation of young journalists, myself being one of them. The way up was hard work and very boring sometimes. I mean, no disrespect to the good people I reported on, but when you sign up to cover corruption and scandal, having to cover which block party served the best street food gets a little tedious and very fattening. I had a lot of fun and met a lot of great people too, but I wasn't truly fulfilled in my profession. I wanted my work to help bring positive change to the country, but getting paid to write about politics at the time was completely impossible. My future laid down two paths: football or crime, and in my foolishness I chose crime. The dictatorship liked us reporting on crime, especially things like murder and robbery, because it made people scared. And long story short, painting the people they disappeared as murder victims put pressure on the police to solve the crimes. They couldn't because their killers were the dictators, but this put a kind of subtle pressure on them and proved a safe form of social activism. And that's how I came to be investigating the actual murder, not just disappearance, of a man named Rodrigo. Without saying too much, Rodrigo's killer was never found. But years later, ballistic analysis showed the prime suspects were two hitmen, imprisoned following a gangland murder. But that brand new data also showed that the pistol which killed Rodrigo was the same one that killed quite a prominent corporate attorney. Now, the police either hadn't seen the connection or refused to, but when I looked into what the attorney had been working on before he was killed, what I found was shocking. I discovered that a huge lawsuit was about to be filed against one of Brazil's biggest logging companies, pertaining to the violent persecution of Amazon tribespeople who lived on land the company wanted. I started researching the connections between the company and the criminal underworld, and without saying too much, I found what looked to be an irrefutable one. My editor realized how big the story was. He knew my life would be in danger if I wrote it, and he knew the paper didn't have the resources to protect me if I did. And so instead, he contacted a friend of his, and this is where the story gets crazy. My editor's old friend ran a much bigger newspaper in the state capital, one that would be very interested in running a story about corporate murder. But he wasn't the only one, which is how a very prominent Brazilian musician stepped in and offered to house me in his country retreat while I wrote the article that would expose the corruption. It was a very generous offer and one that I had no choice but to accept, especially since he was offering me half of his security team to keep me safe at his expense. It was very much a whirlwind in that respect. Everything moved so fast and with such big names being thrown around, and then before I knew it, I was being driven deep into the Amazon to spend a week working in solitude, but more importantly, safety. Because if the megacorps would kill a low-level worker like Rodrigo to keep their dirty secrets from the public, there's no telling what they would do to me. After a long car ride into the jungle, I had to travel by motorboat up the river for several hours. Our singer's retreat was located in an area that was not accessible by road and was what's known as Casas de Caboclo. These are simple wooden homes built on stilts at the edge of a clearing and with a thatched roof and open sides covered by screens. Now, I was aware that I'd be living in such a place while writing my article. The singer said it was where he went after long periods on tour so he could decompress and bring himself back down to earth. But as was explained to me, Humbling himself involved living with no electricity, no telephone connection, and only a primitive sort of well from which to draw drinking water. It was completely off the grid, as people might say today, and while I knew that living there would prove a challenge, I felt safe, and that counted for a lot. And for the most part, the reason I felt so safe was because of how isolated and secluded I was. The surrounding area was dense rainforest with tall trees, thick undergrowth, and vines so thick that it made some places impassable. The ground was constantly wet and muddy, which made life unbearable at times, but the sounds of the jungle were incredible. You could hear birds and insects and howler monkeys calling throughout the day, but at night, the jungle truly came alive. The Amazon is like a Rio favela, a nocturnal place, slow and humid in the daytime, but wild once the sun goes down. Some nights it was so noisy that I found it impossible to sleep, especially when I could hear something screaming in mortal agony after being ambushed by a jaguar. They'd scream and then suddenly, nothing, as the beast sank its teeth into its victim's neck and silenced it forever. The river ran behind the house, wild, brown, and slow-moving. Locals used it for transport, fishing, and bathing, and while it took me a full week before I felt brave enough to wash in waters containing kangaroo, the tiny parasitic fish rumored to swim up men's urethras, I mostly used the river as a relaxing backdrop for my daily exercise. This consisted of an hour's walking after lunch, sandwiched by 2 long writing sessions, after which I'd return to the small wooden table and chair and continue compiling the evidence into the article I hoped would change my country for the better. Now, the isolation helped with focus, but the heat and insects made it tiring, so to energize myself for the afternoon writing session, I'd take a walk by the riverbank and sometimes take a dip to cool off. I didn't bathe on the occasion in question. I simply walked by the riverbank enjoying the solitude and listening to the sounds of the jungle. But in an instant, those sounds suddenly changed. It wasn't uncommon to hear howler monkeys hooting and screeching in the jungle. Day or night, you'd hear them calling out whenever a predator was nearby, and you could always tell when that predator was a big cat because the monkeys would go crazy up there in the trees and would take flight more often than not. Now, this is because big cats like jaguars or pumas are highly efficient killers, and if they're spotted on the move, it usually means they're hunting. But a howler monkey's reaction to a human being is very different, as I learned myself while walking under a tree full of them. They're well aware of how dangerous humans can be, so they call out loudly as you approach them. And they don't just run. They know you can't climb trees like they or a big cat can, so if you walk slowly and quietly and don't make any sudden movements, they'll just simply watch you from above, sounding out only the occasional call to communicate your position to the other members of their troop. And that is what I heard that day, maybe 50 or 60 yards away in the jungle as I walked alone on this muddy path. Now, at first I thought it was a jaguar, in which case I needed to pick up my pace a little to make it back to the house. But when I recognized how familiar the monkey's reaction was to me and realized that there was another person walking through the jungle with me, I felt my heart sinking in my chest. No one was supposed to be out there. No one was supposed to know that I was there. And so the fact that someone appeared to be shadowing me at a distance, it had me fearing for my life. I rushed back to the house as fast as I could. I took a large revolving pistol from under the bed and waited by the window with it, peeping out for any sign that someone was following me. I decided I'd simply given myself a little scare, and it was very unusual to hear or see another person out there, even on the river, but it wasn't impossible that someone was just passing through. Besides, I believed if someone had come all that way, they wouldn't want to hang around and I'd have been attacked already. I skipped my exercise walk for that day, and then the next I walked the opposite way along the river just to be careful. There were no signs of any other people on that walk, and none for the next couple of days too. But then, just less than a week after the howler monkeys indicated their presence, it happened again. I was a smoker at the time, so I was having a ration of cigarettes to get me through. Now, sometimes I felt like I'd happily surrender to the hitmen if it meant getting one last smoke, like they do in the movies. And then when my supply of cigarettes started to get damp and moldy, I had to salvage what I could and dry them out in the sun before I was able to smoke them. I suppose this ordeal might sound pathetic to people who have never been addicted to nicotine, but when I say the cravings are awful, please take my word for it. You become hypersensitive to the smell of a cigarette and become especially sensitive to the scent of tobacco smoke. Which is why, when I was walking through the jungle one day, and I smelled it on the breeze, I was hit by two immediate sensations, one of envy and one of terror. Now, it seems so silly to look back on, but my first thought really was, I need to find this guy so I can ask him for a cigarette. But then reality hit me, and so did the fear. Knowing I wasn't alone again and that someone was close, it scared the hell out of me, most of all because they weren't moving, and they weren't making any noise, and that meant that there was a distinct possibility that they were watching me. I thought I was dead, and as I ran I knew I could only hear the shot if it was a wound and not a kill. I expected everything to just go dark, for existence itself to become non-existence in the time it took to pull a trigger. But as I ran and ran, slamming through the trees, no shot came and I made it back to the house. Now, I immediately went for the gun, then after grabbing a few things and throwing them into my backpack, I ran along the riverbank in the opposite direction to the smoke. In the event that I believed that I'd been compromised, we had a system in place to secure my evacuation. I was to head out into the jungle to where a pre-planned dead drop had been designated. All I had to do was take a rock that had been placed on the ground and shove it into the nook of the tree it lay under. The security company responsible for protecting me said they'd check the dead drop every evening. Then if I'd signaled danger, they'd immediately send a boat and an escort to evacuate me. But if the house was compromised, I couldn't exactly go back to it, not unless I could be sure that it was clear. And so instead of returning to it, I was to run to a tree house the musician had constructed some time ago. It wasn't at all comfortable, and it was so infested with bugs, molds, and fungus that I didn't even try to get any sleep. And even if the place had been pristine, sleep was an impossibility. I stayed awake all night, tuned into all the sounds of the jungle. It might sound counterintuitive, but I was less scared of all those sounds by then. I had come to understand that terrible symphony of nocturnal warfare, and so I felt more confident I could identify the sounds of another human. But even so, the experience was a terrifying one, and I will never forget just how terrible it was to be hunted, with only a revolver I could barely shoot to defend myself. I prayed to God that nothing or no one wishing me harm would find me, and it appears that He listened, if only for that night. I made it to dawn without hearing or seeing anything strange, and then with a pistol at the ready, I made my way back towards the house. Now that was the second time I believed that I'd be shot dead, and it was no easier to deal with than the first time. I had absolutely no confidence in myself to outshoot a trained killer, and even as I approached slowly, carefully, and in a wide arc, my heart was pounding in my chest, because I believed that at any moment my life would end in the blink of an eye. Yet it didn't, and slowly but surely I was able to advance from tree to tree until I spotted the house, along with a man waiting outside of it. He looked professional, like he was from the security company, but in my paranoia I couldn't be sure. I kept quiet as I could, getting closer and closer with him none the wiser. Then I emerged from the foliage with the gun drawn, trying to look like I was skilled with it. I called out to him and asked who he was, and when he saw me, he raised his hands but kept a smile on his face as he told me to keep calm and that he was from the company. Now he knew the name of the company, and he knew my name, and he seemed aware that the dead drop had been triggered. He pointed to the house and asked if the article I was writing was inside. I said yes, and then he told me to collect it, and then and only then did I lower my gun. I thanked him for showing up as I walked past him, and then started telling him about the smoke. I remember asking him, "Was that you?" And I guess when he shook his head, he really was telling the truth. But in the moment, I didn't understand the significance. Now, I remember I then turned my back and placed the gun on the bed so I could collect my things, but no sooner had I stepped away from it, I heard a heavy click. I turned to see my would-be escort had pulled his gun from his holster and was in the process of pointing it at me, and so reacting on pure instinct, I threw my heavy dictaphone towards him and then lunged for a nearby window. I guess hurtling my dictaphone at him was enough to throw his aim off, because all but one of his shots missed as I tumbled through the paneless window and out onto the porch outside. But the one that struck had me screaming in agony. It went right through, splitting my shin bone in the process and crippling me. I was only able to crawl from the porch and into the mud, trying and failing to find my feet in the vain hope that I might be able to hop my way to safety. But I was never going to get away, and as I began to realize that my time on this earth might well be up, the only thoughts in my head were those of my mother. I rolled over onto my back in a sort of fruitless attempt to plead with my executioner, but after walking out of the house and rounding the corner, I could see in his eyes that there was no reasoning with him. I tried anyway, watching as he raised his gun, and then he stopped and I heard a shot. But instead of my whole world going dark or a white-hot shock of pain going through me, I watched with a raised and trembling hand as my would-be killer fell dead. I was still trembling as I heard footsteps coming from behind me, and as I turned to look, I saw a man wearing what looked like regular everyday clothes walking out from the trees. Now, he too knew my name, and then after asking me to confirm it, he got to work bandaging my leg with one of my own t-shirts. When he'd finished gathering up my things, he helped me limp to the boat that would transport me back to civilization, and then from there, I was taken to a hospital where I went into surgery to save my leg. Survival is one hell of a feeling, and it gives you all the cliched second leases on life like the movies say it does. But an even better feeling came when I had my article published, an article which whipped up so much of a storm the politicians promised a crackdown on corporate criminality. Sadly, not everyone who should have gone to prison went to prison, but to get even a shred of justice for the victims is a victory, because that's who we're fighting for when all is said and done, right? People like Rodrigo, who I mentioned earlier. People whose lives were valued at less than the company's bottom line. This is one of the hardest things I've ever had to write, but I've been encouraged to do so by both my family and some highly qualified medical professionals too. So in the hopes that it'll help me process it better, I'm going to try. Nearly 8 years ago, my family's whole world was turned upside down by the sudden and unexpected death of my brother Tom. We grew up here in England, and he was the eldest by 4 years. He was a great big brother, and we always got along, but our interests couldn't have been any different. I was in my late teens when he died, so still very much in my Florence and the Machine and Sims 3 era, but Tom was doing a history degree at uni. And while he'd always been into stuff like the Vikings and the Romans, going to uni obviously took things to a whole new level. After his second year, when he came home for the summer, he was obsessed with medieval Europe. But his stay proved only a pit stop because many months prior, he'd organized a 6-week stay in a replica medieval village up in the Scottish Highlands. Now, I thought that sounded right up his alley, so I was happy for him. But then the more I heard about it, the more it sounded a little bit too intense for my taste, because when they said replica village, they meant replica village. It wasn't a holiday camp by any stretch. It was a serious historical reenactment set up and funded by some Scottish university, and they weren't just doing it for a laugh either. There were no phones, no modern toilets, no electricity, and no running water. Once you were in the village, any preference to events after a certain year warranted a warning. And then once you had 3 warnings, you were quite literally banished from the village. Tom said that they were trying to maintain perfect test conditions so that the things they experienced would be the things their medieval ancestors experienced. Now that way they could understand their problems better and gain a greater understanding of the medieval way of life. Like I said, it sounded like a dream holiday in many ways, and seeing him off was a laugh because we were all making jokes about him speaking Old English upon his return, or waving a sword about and calling for a crusade every time the local miscreants started throwing eggs or toilet paper around the estate. Tom said he'd call us when he got there, as in before he had to hand his phone in, and then he'd call us 6 weeks after when he got it back. Now, we're all really excited to hear from him, and then after 5 weeks, we were counting the days until we got that call from him. But then only about 3 or 4 days before Tom was due to come home, we got a call from a police officer up in Scotland who had some devastating news for us. While Tom and a few other villagers had been out hunting, they'd been walking along the crest of a hill when Tom slipped. Now, the slope wasn't exceptionally steep, so he might have been able to steady himself after a couple of tumbles, but after smashing his head on a rock almost immediately after slipping, he'd been knocked unconscious, and after tumbling down the hill, he was found with a broken neck. The villagers abandoned protocol to try and save his life and had the caretaker, the man who took everyone's phones, call 999 before rushing to the scene with a first aid kit. But there's nothing in a first aid kit that can fix a broken neck, and we were told that only maybe a minute or two after he slipped and fell, Tom was dead. It was all just so tragic. The villagers couldn't move him because he'd suffered a head injury, but neither could the ambulance service actually access the village because the roads turned to narrow, muddy tracks running through woodland, and it was those the villagers used to access their homes. Tom was lying there for about an hour before an air ambulance showed up to take him to hospital, but by then, he'd stopped breathing for almost 45 minutes, and there was no saving him. The police officer Mom and Dad spoke to said his fellow villagers were absolutely devastated, and a few of them actually wrote to us, pen and paper letters too, saying how sorry they were and how lovely Tom was, and that their hearts were just broken like ours were. It was a really nice gesture, to be honest, and those letters meant a lot to me. So much so that I read one of them at his funeral about 2 weeks later. I had to read it through a flood of tears, but I did manage to finish, and everyone said afterwards how beautifully written the letter had been. But now, after my dad announced an email had arrived in his inbox, written by a former member of the village, I'm struggling to decide how to feel about them and what to do with them. And for the second time in 10 years, our entire world was turned upside down. The email had been written by a girl named Sarah, who claimed to have been present at the village at the time of Tom's death. Then, after a string of apologies and claims she wished things could have been different, Sarah had a horrifying confession to make. Tom's death wasn't an accident. He'd been murdered. Sarah explained that he too had been a big history buff and was studying the subject at St. Andrews University when she heard about the replica village. She was told all the same things, that it was a serious reconstruction for the purposes of academic study, and that as long as you followed the rules, a person could learn a whole lot about the past and themselves, and all while having fun doing it. She signed up, was given her arrival date, and then, while the first few days proved a proper shock to the system for her, she eventually found her rhythm and started to really enjoy herself. There was just one big problem, and that was how some of the villagers seemed to be a lot more willing to get into character, as it were, than others. The Middle Ages were not a great time to be a woman or someone who didn't believe in God, and I'm not trying to score some political points by saying this, it's just the truth. And so in order to get actually into character and create the physical and mental conditions by which 14th century peoples lived, the occupant of the replica village tried really hard to get into that headspace. But some tried much, much harder than others. Sarah said the choice punishment for minor infractions was beating, and if the newer villagers didn't place their faith and trust entirely in God, the older villagers treated them like dirt until they came around and started talking and praying like a true Christian. What's more, some of the older villagers weren't at the end of their 6-week stay. They'd been there for literally years, having thrown away their old, more complicated modern lives in favor of living hundreds of years in the past. Now you can get a sense of what Sarah is trying to say in her email before she comes out and says it. When she does, it's not any less shocking. She said the village wasn't just some academic pursuit, and while it might have started that way, it had long since devolved into a kind of off-the-grid cult. Women who'd been beaten or even violated were essentially told that if they went to the police, the entire village would rally around their abuser and ensure that there were no arrests or convictions. The villagers also made it clear that they'd launch a kind of counter-accusation campaign to discredit and demoralize anyone who tried to blow the whistle. Their lives and academic careers would be destroyed systematically. And so with that sword of Damocles hanging over everyone, it took a long time for anyone to find the strength to come forward, which in my opinion made Sarah an exceptionally courageous young woman. There were literally pages and pages describing the dark underbelly of the replica village, and only once she'd really set the scene did Sarah get into what happened to Tom. According to her, he'd taken a real exception to the way some of the villagers were treating their wives, to the point an argument with a village elder had come to blows. The elder punched Tom, Tom punched him back, but then instead of rolling around on the floor like they were in a drunken street brawl, the other male villagers jumped Tom, beat him until he was barely conscious, and then locked him in the village jail for a few days of prayer and reflection, but without any food or water. Sarah said it was the standard procedure for anyone who threatened to blow the whistle, and that each and every time the experience broke them. But by broke them, Sarah didn't mean that they were simply starved into submission, because if that was the case, people would just fake being well again, scarf down a bowl of stew, and then leg it back to the groundskeeper's hut to grab their phone and call the police. But that's not how the village did things. They were smart about it. They had people sit there outside your holding cell, praying for you constantly, and then anyone who unlocked the door to give them food would say things like, "We're praying for you. We can't wait for you to come back to us. We miss you so much." Things like that. It was brainwashing, pure and simple, but from that point on, everything became so horribly clear. Tom was probably the most independent-minded person I'd ever known, or as my dad sometimes called him, a right stubborn bastard is that boy. And if he set his mind on something, it wasn't often that he didn't get it or it didn't happen, which is why I didn't doubt him for a second when he mentioned doing something mental like living in the 14th century for a month and a half. If he decided he was going to do it, Tom got it done. So when Sarah wrote that after 3 days with no food and water, Tom seemed a changed man, I thought, yeah, seemed being the operative word here. I knew in my heart of hearts, having known him for 17 years of my life, that he'd be broken by any such treatment. So when Sarah said that she believed he'd been killed to keep him quiet, and that he hadn't slipped on that hunt that evening, he'd been pushed, I believed it. He was so strong-headed that he couldn't even pretend. Like the time Mum and Dad dragged him to a panto when I was 8, and he was so angry he refused to crack a smile, even when the bloke playing Rumpelstiltskin all but begged him to. And so it made total sense that after however long, pretending he was one of them, as it were, the mask slipped and he made his feelings plain. Sarah said that she thought Tom was caught unawares, that the hunting trip itself might have been a ruse to get him somewhere his killers could fake his accidental death. But I saw it differently. I saw Tom snapping, unable to keep his mouth shut any longer, and then after either slagging off the village, saying he was going to the police, or a scathing combination of the two, I think someone pushed him, and that's how he died. It wasn't some tragic accident. They weren't sorry for our loss. They killed him. My brother was murdered. At least that's what this Sarah person wants us to believe, but I don't even know if I want what she's saying to be true. It might sound horrible, but having Tom's death dragged up like this has been such a mix of emotions. Like I thought I finally had a lid on my grief, and that after putting all that trauma behind me, I'd be left only with my happy memories. And then that email came out of the blue and it was like a bomb was dropped on us. I want to believe this Sarah girl is for real and that she's finally seen sense and done the right thing. But if this place really does make people go mad and turn into the most paranoid, superstitious, and hateful versions of themselves, then how do I know she's not making it up just to spite the village? Dad already emailed Sarah back asking if she's willing to talk over the phone or even meet in person so we can organize reporting what she told us to the police. She says she knows of countless other crimes that have been committed in the village, from common assaults to much more serious incidents of violation, and if that's true, then we might not even need to prove that they killed Tom in order to get some degree of justice. We're literally just waiting for her to reply, but it's been almost a week since we sent the email and we've heard nothing back from her. I suppose if she does get back to us, I'll write a follow-up just to let everyone know what happened, but if not, then I don't know what I'll do, because it means someone decided to basically torture me using the death of my own brother. And I hate living in a world where people like that might exist. My name's Henry. I'm born and raised up here in the state of Wyoming, and I run a hotel here in Cody, which some consider to be the gateway to Yellowstone. There's nothing I enjoy more than regaling our guests with a tale or two, and over the years, local history became a passionate hobby of mine. Not all of history has been put to paper, and it's a sad fact that some of it never will reach the big screen or even the pages of a book. If you got the time, patience, and know-how, you can learn of some pretty wild things that have happened around the Equality State that not too many people know about. You see, Wyoming wasn't settled in a regular sense, and it's the least populated region in America, meaning there's a whole lot of don't know what out there among the mountains and the forests. It's cowboy country through and through, so there are plenty of stories involving gunslingers and outlaws, but there are also native legends, stories about pioneer fur trappers, and even tales from Oregon Trail wagon trains. Yet while there are many stories that have inspired hope and pride, there are just as many that summon feelings of fear, dread, and disgust. And today I'd like to share a very chilling story from the life of a man named Buster Teague. Back in 1860, the Pony Express was started, and this involved recruiting a team of relay riders who would carry mail almost 2,000 miles from Missouri to California in just 10 days. Here in Wyoming, the route cut through Fort Laramie, Devil's Gate, and Fort Bridger, among others. Light riders pushed hard, day and night, hindered by neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night, to deliver news and letters which kept the country stitched together. And while it only lasted 18 months or so before the telegraph took over, those Pony Express riders became legendary. And James Buster Teague was one of them. Teague was not a light rider. Like Wild Bill Hickok himself, Buster was too heavy for the saddle, and so instead of riding the fast relays between stations, he was given the task of putting letters directly into hands all throughout Wyoming territory. This was a slow process, as mailmen not only needed to be able to be polite, punctual, and professional, but they needed to be skilled frontiersmen too. From bad weather or wild animals to native warriors or bloodthirsty bandits, there was plenty to lay a good man low in those days, and sometimes a man paid the ultimate price for choosing honorable work. Buster Teague was well aware of such dangers, which is why he carried 2 Colt revolvers on him during every ride, and it was in the late summer of 1861 that Teague encountered something truly terrifying. At the break of dawn, Buster could ease his mail pouch onto his horse and then head out on a shift that included about 75 to 100 miles of hard riding. He'd cover around 10 miles an hour if the trail was decent, usually at a fast trot or lope, but even in the 1860s, Wyoming was as wild gets. Buster rode through a vast sagebrush flats that stretched for miles, and then he'd hit rivers with bottoms so muddy his horse got stuck. Sometimes the waters were deep and swift enough to dismount and drown him should he not prove skilled enough. But skilled he was. As Buster noted in the journals he kept, life could get really lonely out there in the wilds, but he knew delivering mail was important. You gotta remember that this took place right at the start of the American Civil War, so at a time when people didn't know if they were going to have a country next year, keeping people in the loop felt like a very important job. Teague would pull up to some remote station or settlement, hand off the mochila, a Spanish word meaning satchel or backpack, and then after a quick bite to eat and a cup of coffee, he'd be on the move to the next stop. He had to move quick to stay on schedule, as there was a lot out there to slow him down. And like I said, many a good mail carrier lost their lives at that time, and the same thing almost happened to Teague one day when he was out riding the trails. So one day, Buster's riding along a lonely stretch of Sweetwater, minding his own with that mochila full of mail, when out of nowhere, the Cheyenne brave comes bursting from the rocks in an ambush. He cried out his war whoop, and then, after aiming his rifle, he let loose a shot that ripped through Buster's leg. Buster's own pistol shots kept the brave at bay, but having dropped his now empty rifle, the brave produced a tomahawk and began charging from the rocks. Teague took off down the trail, clinging to the saddle while his leg burned like there was fire in it, but all he could do was clench his teeth, spur his pony on, and hope that he made it someplace safe. A few miles down the trail, Buster slid off his horse, half falling because his leg was giving out on him, and then he hunkered down in the dirt to patch himself up. He rips a strip off his shirt, ties a tourniquet, and then digs out as much of that bullet as he can with his knife. He had to grit his teeth so hard they almost cracked, but he got the job done. Then after he's all bandaged up and ready to move, he takes a minute to catch his breath and survey the scene around him. And that's when Buster spots a patch of dirt nearby that looked like it's been disturbed. He found his feet and then limped over to check it out, but when he looked inside, he just about recoiled in horror. It was a shallow pit, and inside were a whole bunch of human bones. Now Buster could tell right away that they were human and wrote in his diary that he counted at least a dozen flesh-stripped skulls, but it was the longer bones that really caught his attention. They'd been picked clean, with all signs pointing towards the fact that someone had cut away the flesh and then cracked open the bone to extract the precious protein-rich mush inside, or in other words, all signs pointed to cannibalism. Buster had heard rumors about it for years, how certain bands resorted to cannibalism in hard times, or for the sake of dark rituals. But he'd always figured that those were nothing but tall tales told by trappers trying to scare folks off their patches. But then there it was, the not-so-living proof that rumors were true. Yet regardless of who those bones once belonged to and how they got there, Buster had to keep moving. He patched himself up as best he could, got back on that horse somehow, then pushed on into the wilds in the hopes of finding shelter for the night. But as the setting sun had started to paint the hills with bloody reds and oranges, and the shadows of tree trunks either side of the trail were starting to reach for him, Buster started to become afraid. He knew that, should he try and camp out under the stars, he'd be easy prey for a pack of wolves. And so on and on he went, hoping beyond hope that he'd find somewhere safer. And then suddenly, as if by a miracle, he began to smell wood smoke. Buster slowly pushed on, trying to hone in on the source of the smoke, and then he spotted it. A secluded little cabin tucked back in a draw, half hidden by cottonwoods and a rocky outcrop. He spotted smoke curling out of the chimney, and then as he got closer, he smelled food being prepared inside. So not wanting to spook the occupants, Teague called out to announce himself, and that he meant them no harm. Seconds later, a young woman of maybe 20 steps out into the porch. Pretty in a frontier kind of way, with her hair tied back and wearing a simple dress, she seemed alarmed at first, but then took one look at Teague's wounded leg and waved him inside. Buster later wrote that he near fell from his horse with relief and then almost collapsed from the pain of climbing off his horse after balancing his weight wrong. The young woman was apparently a lot stronger than she looked, and she helped bear his weight as she helped Teague into the snug interior of her cabin. The floor was swept clean. There was a stone fireplace crackling away, and a table with some bread and dried meat. There were herbs hanging above a big old pot, which bubbled away from being set over that fireplace. The girl said her name was Annie Mae, and then her husband was out hunting and that she'd fix him a bowl of venison stew should he require refreshment. Teague gratefully accepted her offer, and then after she sat him down with a bowl and a hunk of bread, Annie Mae went about cutting away his pant leg and properly cleaning his wound. Teague said they talked a while as she worked, and she explained that they'd been living a quiet life out there, away from folks. He told her he was a mail rider who almost got bushwhacked on the trail, but he didn't mention the bone pit on account of not wanting to scare the girl. The girl nodded, like violence was nothing new out there, and then before long, the door swung open and in walked her husband. Teague wrote that he was a tall fella named George, bearded and carrying a rifle. He looked Buster over with his narrow eyes for a moment, and then once Annie Mae explained what had happened, he smiled and told Teague he was welcome to stay as long as he needed. Now it all seemed kind enough, but Teague wrote in his journal that something about the way the man looked at him seemed off, like he was sizing him up for something, not just looking at him. A couple of hours later, and after giving Teague a blanket and a spot on a straw tick in the corner, the trio settled down to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. Even with the few gulps of whiskey George gave him, Teague's leg hurt something fierce, and every time he managed to drift off, some subtle movement would send pain shooting through his leg. His mind started fixating on that pit full of bones, whether or not George knew that they were there, or if they had some arrangement with the local Cheyenne whereby they paid tribute to live there. He lay there wondering and planning his next move until dawn broke, and then as the sky turned this shade of pale blue, Annie Mae brewed a pot of coffee while George went out to chop firewood. Having been told that he could help himself to another cup of coffee and not wanting to interrupt his host's work, Buster Teague tried hopping over to the stove himself. It was a dumb move, because about halfway there he loses his balance and knocks a chair over on the way down. The chair hits a panel beneath a sink and closet unit, causing the panel to come loose. Then, in his guilt, he crawled over to it in order to inspect the damage he'd done. Teague later wrote that the panel seemed to have come away easy, but it was only on closer inspection that he realized its flimsy attachment was by design, and that the panel concealed a secret storage space. This didn't alarm him, as a young couple like that most likely needed a place to hide valuables from folk who wished to rob them. But while trying to put the panel back into place, Teague caught a glimpse of what was inside, and when he did, his blood ran cold. Because inside that little cubbyhole were a pair of buckskin leggings, a war shirt with beadwork, and some moccasins. The same clothes worn by the Cheyenne brave that had attacked him on the trail. Teague wrote that things didn't make sense for him at first, and he assumed George had killed the Cheyenne warrior following his own encounter with him. But on the point of when the killing took place, Teague's train of thought started to collapse in on itself. Why hadn't George said anything? Why sneak the clothes in there in the middle of the night? Teague said he'd noticed George fiddling with something under the sink that night, but hadn't assumed anything strange. But why wait until he was asleep to stow it away in there? And that's when everything made sense, I guess, and he realized that it wasn't some hostile that had attacked him, but rather George, the man whose hospitality he'd enjoyed for a night. The pit of scrapped bones would explain the abundance of meat the couple enjoyed, and in a place where hunting meant clashing with the Cheyenne. It wasn't venison that was in that stew. It was human flesh. Teague wrote that in the moment, he couldn't be entirely certain of his suspicions. He had a set of clothes, not a confession, and had not witnessed the couple's supply of meat being carved from a human cadaver. Yet as a yell of concern from George broke the silence, Teague realized that revealing his discovery provoked immeasurable risk, and made the decision not to disclose it. He pulled the chair away from the wash basin as George walked through the door, and then held firm his poker face until he was in the clear. Now he knew that to depart right then may well mean certain death. If Teague's suspicions were correct, George and Annie Mae had no doubt made plans to add him to their stew pot. He realized that they'd been hoping that he'd die of his injuries, which saved them from the trouble of cutting his throat during the night and making a mess of their nice straw tick. But on the other hand, if he didn't pass on, they could always fatten him up a little using the salted, preserved remains of the previous victims, and then put him into the slaughter once he was healthy and chubby enough to move on. If that was the case, Teague needed to plan his next moves very carefully, and so that's what he did. He played dumb, kept on playing the grateful victim, and began planning his escape. The next morning, after another sleepless night, Teague announced his departure to George and Annie Mae. The sleepless night had been for two reasons. Firstly, Teague had been busy putting his escape plan into action, but secondly, his escape required him to gather his strength, and gathering his strength meant gulping down a lot of what was bubbling away in the couple's stew pot. He wrote that while he told himself it was nothing but venison, what he saw lying in that bone pit had him forcing down every gulp. Teague's poker face was pushed to the absolute limit, as reacting poorly to their fare might cause George and Annie to become suspicious. But once again it held firm, and they retired to their small bedroom once darkness had fallen, only to emerge in the morning to Teague's news of his departure. In his journal, Teague describes how George and Annie Mae exchanged a quick look of apprehension. The former smiled at him and proposed he stay another night to let his leg heal a little more, but Teague insisted. He said folks would start to worry about him if he stayed missing much longer, and he didn't want to be responsible for some poor kid getting scalped and shot full of arrows on his account. Teague said the air grew thick, but with his pistols on him and caught unprepared, George and Annie had little choice but to accept his departure and let him pass. Having already gathered his things, Teague headed out to saddle up his horse, and as he did, he heard the cabin door open and close again behind, and George and Annie Mae stepped out onto the porch. He felt their eyes burning into his back as he tightened the cinches, and while every move made his leg burn, he refused George's offer of assistance. Teague put one foot in the stirrup, swinging up low while holding back yelps of pain, and then as he plunked himself down in the saddle, that's when George raised the shotgun he left with Annie Mae for defense and pointed it right at Buster Teague. Buster said George had the decency to apologize before he announced he wasn't letting him leave, and then without another word, he took a more careful aim at his target and then pulled the trigger. Yet instead of a bang and a spray of shot, George's pull of the trigger yielded nothing but a dull click. He tried again with the second barrel, but his effort yielded the same surprising result. And then just as a panicked George broke open his gun to check if it was loaded, Buster Teague pulled 2 shotgun shells from his coat pocket, both of which he'd removed from the shotgun that previous night. His journal states that he asked them, "Looking for these?" which in my mind must have made for quite a moment. But before George could turn and rush into the cabin for his pistol or more shells, Buster Teague shot him down like a dog. The shot caught him square in the chest, knocking him back into the doorframe before he crumpled and gasped, with blood spreading on his shirt. Annie Mae's face twisted up with rage, and she let out a scream that barely sounded human, and that Teague wrote sounded more like a banshee straight from hell. He said her face changed, all twisted up with fury and madness, then she came flying off the porch at him with a knife that she took from someplace. She was screaming curses, transforming into something feral and demonic right before Teague's very eyes. Not literally a demon, mind you, but the way she moved, just a ball of wild evil and hatred, it scared him as bad as any peril previously faced. The woman's scream spooked Buster's horse, but he held firm, aimed his pistol, and fired another shot in her direction. He said she kept coming, that the first shot did nothing but knock her down for a moment. Then she was on him, clawing at his leg and trying to tear open the wound. Teague recocked his pistol, then fired again. Only that time, the barrel was just about touching the woman's forehead, and there was no getting up from that one, let me tell you. But even after she fell, Teague wrote that she still glared up at him as she lay there twitching, her eyes full of something unholy. Teague didn't stick around to make sure they were dead. He kicked his horse into a gallop, and pain be damned, he rode hard away from that cursed cabin and the monsters who called it home. He wrote that blood began seeping through the bandage Annie Mae had torn up, but he didn't slow until he was back on the trail and well on his way towards the pony station he was expected at. When he arrived, Teague slid off his horse and landed on the ground with a painful thud. The station keeper ran out to help him, then once he was inside, and after a few gulps of good whiskey, Buster told the station keep where he'd been, what he'd seen, and what had happened to him. After listening to the story of how he'd been ambushed, found help, and then had to shoot his way out when they turned on him, the station keep ordered his assistant to go grab a doctor stationed about 30 miles away. Now, he wouldn't be there until the next morning, but Teague wasn't going anywhere. 2 sleepless nights had left him exhausted and in dire need of rest, and so the next time he opened his eyes, the doctor was standing over him, ready to inspect his wound. Following some good treatment and a few days' rest, Buster Teague got back on his horse and then headed back to Fort Laramie. He was hauling a fresh mochila within a month, and apparently he wanted nothing more to get back in the saddle and rid himself of the boredom he felt at the fort. But even by his own admission, Buster Teague was never quite the same after the encounter with George and Annie Mae, if indeed those were their real names. He found he didn't trust as easy as he once had, and that he always watched the shadows a little closer as they started to fall. He said he had no regrets traveling to Wyoming for work, but knew plainly that the wilds of Wyoming held secrets worse than any outlaw killers or scalp-hungry war party. For there were cannibals out there, monsters hiding behind friendly faces, who lived on the flesh of the lonely and the lost. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links are in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, congratulations to the Swifts.